Hey guys, Toby Mathis here, and I get this question all the time, which is how do I protect my business asset from lawsuits? And we've seen this occur repeatedly where somebody has a business and there's a liability occurrence. It could be a wrongful termination, it could be a claim from a client or somebody who's aggrieved, or it could be an accident by one of the employees and you're on the hook for it. And there's assets inside that business that now are exposed. And so I'll show you some simple techniques to make sure that you don't find yourself in a bad situation if any of those events occur, because given a long enough time horizon, they're an absolute certainty. Let's start by just divvying up our assets so you understand what we're talking about, and then some of the strategies that we can utilize to minimize any of the risks that are out there. So first off, you're up here in the personal quadrant. And I'm going to put a little A for active and P for passive, because things on the left side are things that I'm actually working in. And as a result, if I have those things like my home, I have a car, maybe you have kids over here, right? All of those create liabilities for me. Like I drive the car, my house, somebody could fall down the stairs, my kids could harm somebody, especially if they're teenagers or driving around. We've seen that just way too often. And you start realizing that, hey, we want to compartmentalize these types of liabilities. Number two, this is the business realm. This is where you have your active businesses, and we're generally going to isolate those using LLCs or corporations. So let's just say that you have an S-Corp business that's sitting over there doing its ABC Inc., and it's selling widgets. We're just going to use that as an example. But this is your active business. Your spouse may actually have another business over there. And so let's just say that this is, just for lack of a better word, we're going to say, hey, that they're doing an Uber driving, right? So like, hey, I'm driving people. So they have an Uber business. And maybe that's also an S-Corp. You're going to want something around that. So we have a couple of businesses. Then we go over to the passive side. And up here in this quadrant, we call it our no-risk assets, because they do not create risk for anybody. This is where your stocks, your bonds, your things that don't create risk. Like if I own Microsoft stock, I'm not going to get sued for owning Microsoft stock. In other words, I am not at risk because of what Microsoft does. Let's say Microsoft gets sued into oblivion. My only risk is that I'm going to lose the asset. The asset doesn't get to come over and take my other assets. If I have a business and I do not have it isolated inside that S-Corp, for example, and I do something, they would be able to come take all of these assets, but by isolating these things, I can create a nice asset protection plan just by isolating them. With these, I like to use a Wyoming LLC because I can have anonymity and nobody can ever take it from me. It's not in the public record, so it's hard for anybody to ever find. So because of that, I like to put my safe assets there, and then even if somebody went after me in my jurisdiction, it would be really, really difficult for them to go and get those assets out of Wyoming. Like they'd actually have to file another action. It's going to be very, very expensive, cost prohibitively, plus they don't even know it's there. So we've been doing this for more than 2 decades, and we just don't see those lawsuits. It's just, they don't happen because nobody even sees that it's sitting there. I always get the comment. Somebody is always in the comment saying, well, if you get sued, you have to disclose your assets. Not in the lawsuit. If I get into a car accident, they don't get to examine me and say, what are all the assets you own? That's called supplemental proceedings. That's after there's liability and they're trying to collect on a judgment. What we're talking about is preventing a lawsuit at its inception because they don't see a whole bunch of assets. I want you to remember that because it's actually going to play into how, as a business owner, you want to create protections as well. Last one is the risk quadrant, and this is where we have our real estate, and specifically our rental real estate. So let's say that we have 2 properties down here, property 1, property 2. I am going to want to isolate those because those, if I leave them unisolated, they could take my business, they could take my personal assets, they could try to take my non-risk assets unless I'm using a really cool plan like you got for me, right? It'll be really difficult for them to ever get it. But if it's unprotected and unisolated, then the liability is huge. So we're going to put a box around these. Generally speaking, we would isolate both properties from each other because what we don't want something happens on this property and they take this one too. What we don't want is something happens on this property, they take my stocks. What we don't want is something happens on this property, they take all my business assets. So by putting a simple plan in place where we're using limited liability entities, which are LLCs, limited partnerships, corporations, Wyoming statutory trusts, or certain types of trusts, I can use different entities depending on what type of asset it is and where it's held, and I can protect myself. Now, the purpose of this video was what happens if somebody comes over here and they're going to try to take my asset. Can I keep them inside that entity? That's number one. And what we call that inside liability. The liability was created inside the box, not outside the box. If I run into a busload of nuns, sorry, I went to Catholic school, but let's say that I hit a busload of nuns and I get sued by all the sisters. That's outside liability. That's me doing something. If I sell widgets and one of those widgets hurts somebody or I breach a contract inside that entity, it stays inside that entity. That's called inside liability. So here's what happens. We see this all the time. Somebody gets sued and inside there they have a bunch of cash. In fact, we just had this with a particular individual came to us and they got sued. They had over $1 million sitting in their business bank accounts and they come to us saying, what can I do now? Well, now you're in a situation where you have avoidable transaction, fraudulent conveyance, you have issues because you know that there's liability. So a judge would probably punish the lawyers who helped you move an asset and you as well. They're not going to recognize that transfer if you're just trying to move it out because you owe it to somebody. You have a known creditor, you're getting sued, you run into issues. But that's because you waited. That's because you left the money in that business. If you want to make sure that you don't get your business nuked and end up in a bad situation, there's two things you do. Number one, you isolate the liability inside that particular entity and you keep it separate. Number two, anything that's really worth something to a third party, like your cash, like perhaps you have a bunch of vehicles or other assets, maybe you have real estate, do not put it in that business. You want to hold it outside. So for example, this might be a building that your business is renting. You would lease it from that LLC to that business. If it's the same ownership, by the way, I can combine those and actually use the losses from that real estate against my business. A lot of you guys don't realize that, a lot of accountants don't realize it. It's called grouping. I can do that. But from an asset protection standpoint, what this has done is it's taken the asset and it's moved it outside of the firing range of that particular business. At the same time, something happens on this business, something happens on that building. I'll give you a real life example actually, because there was a business building and there was 2 window washers that electrocuted themselves on a commercial building. The gal had no asset protection plan in place at all. It was about 20 years ago I talked to this, the client who came to us because they didn't want that to happen again. They lost 15 properties as a result of this. The judgment was huge. It was 2 young men. And they managed to get past the insurance because the young men had their license lapse. In other words, they weren't licensed and bonded as required under their insurance policy. So the insurance was able to say, nope, we're not going to cover it. So she was on the hook individually. And all of her assets she ended up forfeiting over 15 properties. It was just a madhouse, right? But what we want to make sure of is if something happens, it stays in that box. We don't want them to come over and take the assets of that business because that business is functioning. It's creating revenue. It has its own intellectual property, which is its goodwill for its customers and things like that. So if you've been in business for a while, there's value. So you want to isolate the risk assets from it to the extent that you can outside. So if I have risk assets like real estate, isolate them outside. Somebody might say, well, what about cars? Well, cars don't drive themselves. It's the employee who's driving the car that creates the liability, right? Owning the car car doesn't go down there and self-drive itself, although now they're starting to, right? But it's always somebody's responsible as an individual for controlling that vehicle. So when I drive down the road, if I have a leased vehicle from, let's say, GMAC doesn't get sued when I get into a car accident. I get sued because I was driving, even if I don't own the vehicle, right? So that's not what creates the liability, and that's not my big worry. The employees are the big worry, so I want to isolate those. Now, what about those non-risk assets? The cash. It has assets. Maybe I have intellectual property that's very, very valuable. Maybe I have royalty rights or licensing or things like that. Maybe I've created a bunch of stuff. Do I leave them in that business? If I do, and I get sued, that's on the chopping block. If I isolate it, then I can lease it back, I can license it back, or in the case of, but let's just be real, cash, I just need to get the cash out of the business up into a protected entity so that if somebody comes here, if I have angry employee, you let me go, even though I was the laziest employee, I am going to say that you fired me for some untoward reason because whatever, fill in the blank. Maybe it's discrimination, maybe it's age, maybe it's you looked at them wrong, maybe it's whatever, just fill in the blank. Nowadays you could sue anybody for just about anything, but they come after you. What you want to make sure of is that your assets, the dollars, are over here because now they can't get to it. Somebody comes here, they can't go right up here. They would have to do is they're going to be stuck in that business. Even if they came up here, they're still stuck. They're still stuck. Even if they manage to pierce the corporate veil, which sometimes happens. It's rare when you run your business the right way. But every now and again, let's say you have personal responsibility. Somebody sues you personally because of something you said to them, and somehow they convince a jury or a judge or somebody to come up here, you still have your money isolated. What it does, it allows you to actually have a settlement posture. It enables you to fight for another day. It enables you to force a settlement as opposed to just being a punching bag if you're going through a lawsuit. And that's really how it works when it comes to setting yourself up as a business and how you avoid lawsuits and how you avoid that death punch that kills your business. Because really what you want to do is be able to say, like, hey, keep good insurance and be in a situation where you can isolate the assets so that you are not, it's not just a free-for-all where they're coming in and they can pin their ears back and take all these, everything that's of value. If you isolate it before the liability, in other words, I have a business, let's say it's an S Corp, there's no tax for taking money out of the S Corp. I want you to realize that. So I see all these doctors and dentists, consultant business owners, again, we'll use ABC Widget Company. I'm selling widgets. Why am I leaving all this cash in there? I can just take it out and put it up here. Well, what if I need more cash? Put it back in. Just what you need. Feed it just enough. It's kind of like a workhorse. I don't want to overfeed my workhorse because what happens when you overfeed the workhorse? It gets fat and lazy or it founders, right? So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're taking the asset out of there because it works for asset protection. It'll make it to where it's available to you in the event that you end up in litigation. It's very, very helpful to actually have cash on the side that they can't get to, but that you could defend yourself. So again, you could actually defend and force yourself into a settlement situation so you can get rid of those things. Now, I know that there's frivolous suits out there, and you're like, I'm never going to give anybody money. There's something to be said for getting out of things and being able to pay, even if it's a peppercorn. Hey, here's a settlement nuisance value. Get out of my life so that I'm not staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. pretending I'm Perry Mason, thinking of all the ways I'm going to sue that person, all the things I'm going to do to them. Bad thoughts start happening at 3 a.m. when you're in a lawsuit, right? You don't need it. It affects you emotionally. It hurts your health. It does all that. This is how you isolate those assets so that you can get out of things quickly and hopefully avoid them entirely. Because a lot of times what these folks do is if they know that a business is running lean, they're not going to try to take it out. Like you don't get shook down. Who gets shook down? The people where they know there's deep pockets. Those guys get shook down. Those businesses get shook down. In which case, just make sure, again, you have good insurance. Make sure you have a good umbrella, a business umbrella, and see what it actually covers. You got to have a primary coverage first. Umbrella is a secondary coverage, so it's not like it's automatic. But a lot of times it'll cover the lawyer expense so you can actually defend yourself. And then isolate your risk and non-risk assets from each other, from you, and from your businesses. You do this, you're in a great situation. You could force settlements. You don't do this, you're a punching bag. I don't want you to be a punching bag. Hope this helps. If you like this type of information, please click that like and subscribe. And better yet, if you could go down in the comments and let me know topics that you'd like me to address. I absolutely read them, and I will absolutely take it serious, and I will create content for you. So like and subscribe, and I'll see you later.